In this video, I'm going to talk about heritage language research in the area of phonetics and phonology. So first, I'm going to briefly recap what phonetics and phonology are concerned with because it's been a little while since we did that at the beginning. I'll talk about why it matters in heritage language and talk about the research findings and some unanswered questions. Some of these are discussed in the Polinsky reading that you're doing for phonetics and phonology research. So hopefully this will be able to kind of unpack some of that because I know that research can be a little bit dense. So just to recap, phonetics is concerned with speech sounds, what sounds are in the inventories of individual languages, and these are called phones. So it's just what sounds are in dominant language versus what sounds are in a heritage language, if you're thinking about it for our purposes. And there are different kinds of phonetics. Articulatory phonetics has to do with how sounds are articulated. Acoustic phonetics are concerned with the physical properties of sound, like when you record on your speech app on your phone, you can see a waveform, for example. That's acoustic phonetics. And auditory phonetics is how we perceive speech sounds. Phonology has to do with patterns of sounds. So how sounds influence each other, how they go together in the language, which sounds are distinctive, which ones are phonemes. So if you remember from the beginning of the semester, we talked about how sip versus zip in English have one sound that's different, so they have two different phonemes, and that's what's responsible for their having different meanings. And if you look at this the section here, languages have different sets of phonemes. This K with the superscript H, that's an aspirated K. It has that little puff of air like K. And is it distinct from a K without a puff of air? These are two phonetic sounds, but phonologically, how speakers think of those sounds is they think of them as having a meaning contrast or not. Like, do they create a meaning contrast or not? That depends on the language. So for English, these two sounds, the answer is no, they are not different phonemes. They do not create a meaning contrast. Because you can pronounce the word cup as cup with that puff of air with the aspiration, or you can pronounce it as cup and it still means the same thing. It just sounds a little bit different, sounds a little bit off if you don't have that aspiration, because a native English speaker is supposed to have the aspiration. In Hindi, though, whether you use the aspirated K or not actually is much more critical, because if you don't, then you're going to get a different meaning, and if you do, you get a different meaning. So, kal without aspiration, and I don't speak Hindi, so forgive me if any one of you does. It means yesterday or tomorrow, and kal with the aspiration means wicked person. So those are quite different words. So it's important for heritage speakers to be able to use the sounds in their languages appropriately and to perceive the sounds appropriately. So if you have a Hindi heritage speaker and English dominant, they have to be able to navigate these basically distinctions that exist across the languages. So I'm going to give as an example Spanish and English vowels, right? As far as what inventory of sounds there are in Spanish and English. And I'm sorry that these show up as like misspelled, but anyway. So in Spanish, if we look at the single vowels, they're called monophthongs. We have I, E, A, O, U, and the high front and mid, central, and back. This refer to the like features of vowels, the positions of vowels, essentially. American English has many more vowels. And so English has a different set of vowels in its inventory than Spanish. So if you're a Spanish-English bilingual, you have to manage these two vowel systems. And they're not all the vowels, but just looking at the monophthongs, single vowels. So why does it matter for heritage languages when we look at phonetics and phonology? For the longest time, heritage speakers basically have been described as sounding pretty native. So not a lot of research initially had been conducted on phonetics and phonology. And most of the research had been conducted on morphology and syntax and word knowledge, because those are just much more obvious. When somebody, for example, says something that sounds grammatically off, like, I'm going to just make something up for Spanish, but if you're using the wrong endings on verbs, the wrong inflectional affixes, that's very noticeable. And if you have an accent that's pretty close to native, then that's not as, you're not really going to pay attention to that. So researchers wanted to look at the morphology and syntax more than they did at phonetics and phonology. So impressionistically, even basilectal speakers, so those that are at the lowest proficiency, they sound native-like. Yet there's still this discernible heritage accent that's being identified. So heritage speakers they sound native-like, but not quite native, but better than L2 learners, than second language learners. So we want to identify, what gives this heritage accent. And in the Polinsky reading, she goes a lot more into detail about that. And still, there's a lot of research to be done in this area. So the questions that researchers ask when they look at heritage language phonetics and phonology are basically listed here. We want to know, why do they sound more native-like, even when their morphosyntax is not great? How native do they actually sound? So what is this heritage accent? How are the phonologies of bilinguals developing when they're simultaneously learning both languages, or when they're learning them sequentially? How much input is necessary, and what kind of linguistic experience is necessary and sufficient to get the sounds? So how long do you need to be exposed to the language to be able to get the phonology, to understand that and to remember it? What about the difference between the perception and the productive system? The perception, can you perceive the sound distinctions? Can you produce the sound distinctions? And is there a bidirectional influence between the heritage language and the dominant language? So does the heritage language also influence the dominant language, or only the other way around? So there are a lot of questions, more than these two. So what we know so far from L2 research, because a lot more research had been done on second language acquisition before working with heritage language. So second language acquisition, remember, is learning a language basically as an adult or young adult, as a second language. You've never been exposed to it before until you start taking it in school, for example. So what we know from a second language acquisition in adulthood is that the phonological system may never actually fully develop, or it develops very slowly. And for example, I am a second language learner of English, and I started learning English when I was about 12, when I was in 6th grade in Romania. And even though I think that I speak English pretty well, I have a pretty good command of the language and perception and understanding of the language, I still probably do not sound exactly like a native speaker. There's still a detectable accent, especially at different times, depending on how stressed I am, or, depending on the situation, sometimes that accent kind of comes through a little bit more. And we also know from this heritage, not from heritage, but from L2 acquisition research, that initially the second language is actually processed through the first language system. So basically the sounds in the L2 are perceived and produced like in the L1. And this phonological system often just persists, just like I was saying. It doesn't really change. Can you get by? Of course, sure. Do you still sound and maybe perceive the second language differently than a native speaker? Yes. Extensive exposure to the second language can also lead to a separate long-term memory representation of the sound. So what this means is that when we say memory representation, is like how are those sounds represented in our brain? How does our brain interpret those sounds and remember them? And the bottom line is that the phonological system actually develops pretty early on, and that's why it's important to get have exposure to a language early on. Okay, so in heritage languages, even very early simultaneous and sequential bilinguals appear to develop distinct phonologies. And I want to point you back to the Paradis reading that we did in the first or second week. And I want to just play this short audio. This is from my daughter when she was 3 years, 3 months. And you can see that even though she had unequal input between Romanian and English in the household, she still at that age had two differentiated systems. And you'll be able to discern the difference in pronunciation even though it's in Romanian here. But basically she and I are discussing how her dad pronounces one word when he tries to say a word in Romanian, and she's going to say how he says it, which you'll hear the emphasis on a particular sound that he doesn't say correctly in Romanian, and how she says it. So that's again for sounds, differentiated systems.
Tu e șmechere.
Dar Daddy cum spune? Daddy poate să spună șmechere?
Nu.
Cum spune el?
Șmechere.
Cum spune mai spune odată?
Șmechere.
Și tu cum spui?
Șmechere.
So if you hear that last sound, the ra part, that's the one that was being emphasized there. Also, what we know is that heritage speakers are generally better than second language learners at the perception of phonemes in each language, and also better at production. But they're not all the same. They don't have the same levels. So remember, there's always variation in heritage speakers. And they're also better at distinguishing sound contrasts than monolingual native speakers, which is actually very interesting. So if you have a monolingual speaker of English, and you put them in an experimental condition and have them tell you, press a button when they hear a sound changing, and their sounds from their native language, the heritage speakers actually are better at doing that task than the monolingual English speakers. So basically the experience with the different languages attunes your perceptual system much more keenly than just hearing one language. And also, heritage speakers are actually more similar in how they pronounce the sounds of their heritage language, so there is little variation in production. And for this, I want to direct you back to the Polinsky reading on phonetics and phonology, with that good enough type of pronunciation that they do, where they produce a sound that's good enough for the language. It passes, it's good enough. There is not as much variation. Okay. So what is the input experience that they have that's needed for heritage speakers? So several researcher groups have done experiments looking at perception in heritage language phonetics and phonology. So Au et al. 2002 basically found that even overhearing a language in childhood seems to provide an advantage later on in life for heritage relearners. So when these mostly are done with college students, experiments with students who are taking Korean for Korean speakers or Spanish for Spanish speakers in college, they overheard the language in childhood, or maybe spoke the language in childhood, and then they had a long interruption and they want to now relearn it when they're in college. So even overhearing the language in childhood seems to provide an advantage, and speaking the language in childhood provides an even greater advantage. So speaking the language is better than overhearing it. Overhearing it is better than nothing, right? So that's pretty powerful, actually. Your brain is able to perceive that and actually remember it long term. So how do we know? Again, from lots of experimental research on both perception and production studies at a given point in time, like the Godson study looking at Armenian vowels, and also longitudinal studies, so case studies following a small number of individuals, or maybe a single individual usually. A lot of times researchers study their own families or their own kids, because this type of work is very time consuming and you need access to your to your subjects, basically, on an ongoing basis. So, what is learned in childhood? As I mentioned earlier, overhearing is better than not overhearing it. So, in childhood, pre-verbal infants, so before they even start talking, they learn the melody, the rhythm, and intonation of their language from hearing the language in the environment. Okay, and they become attuned to the languages that they're learning, so that by 10 months of age, they start to lose the ability to distinguish contrasts that do not appear in their native languages. Initially, if you remember from language acquisition early on, when we first looked at language acquisition, initially children are able to distinguish sounds across languages, but then as they get older, so towards 10 months, they start to ignore non-native contrasts and pay attention to just the native language contrasts. So the phonological system develops early. That team that I mentioned earlier that looked at overhearing, they wanted to see how long this overhearing would last. So what they, this idea that children pay attention to this information very early on. So if a child was exposed to the language early on, is it still there somewhere? Turns out that it is. And they studied groups in Los Angeles, again, like I said, college students. Both groups, in Los Angeles, there are a lot of Spanish speakers. So even if you only overheard the language in childhood, you probably still overheard it over time just because of the environment where you are. Like, you hear Spanish somewhere in the store. So it's possible that those perceptual abilities have been reinforced over time, even though it wasn't necessarily directly at the participants themselves. So pure overhearers are really kind of hard to find. But technically, they compared adult learners of Spanish who were overhearers of Spanish in childhood with those that had no regular exposure to Spanish until age 14 when they started taking the Spanish class. Right? So the idea was that if overhearing in childhood is beneficial, then childhood overhearers should have better Spanish accents than the typical L2 learners. So they looked at these students in college, some who had early childhood exposure and some who did not. So they were in Spanish classes at UCLA, and they had these are the profiles of the students that participated. They were matched for gender composition and for instructors that they had to make sure that there wasn't some difference there. And also they used 10 native speakers who were included as a comparison group. It's important for all these studies to make sure that you carefully select your participants so that you know that they were actually exposed to the language in childhood, because you're asking them to self-report to what they did in childhood. So how can you really tell? So they always use childhood slang terms as kind of a test to see did they actually did they hear this language, were they spoken to in this language when they were children, because that's the only thing that would explain their knowledge of these words. Otherwise they probably wouldn't have been exposed to them in childhood. So the findings were that native speakers, which were the control group, performed better than overhearers, but overhearers performed better than L2 learners. So this study concluded that that overhearing the language actually pays off as an adult. Okay. How did they conduct this study? They read aloud 36 Spanish sentences that they saw on a screen. So again, this is they're looking to see if overhearing the language translates into better pronunciation. Right? So they read 36 Spanish sentences as if they were saying them to a Spanish speaker, and they were to stress the second word, which was the target word. And so each word was in the frame, like diga some word, por favor. So like say blank, please. And they were looking for two things. They were looking for voice onset time. So they were looking for basically that did they pronounce the P, T, and K with aspiration or without aspiration, and voiced stop weakening. So in Spanish, ba, da, and ga are produced as a v, the, and the when they are in between vowels. So they wanted to see how that pronunciation was done. Okay. So they looked at those particular sounds because voice onset time is a very common feature to research. And there's a tutorial that I posted a link for on Google Courses, so you can just, it's very short, but it'll help you understand a little bit more about this. And it's relatively easy to measure because you can just measure acoustically on a computer screen. You can just do the recording and you can literally measure it in seconds how long it takes. So let me just tell you a little bit about this. I know this is getting very detailed, but this is the kind of research that's being done to understand, this is having a different voice onset time is what gives people a different accent, because you're just you start to vibrate your vocal cords a little bit earlier than a native speaker, or a little bit later than a native speaker. You just do things a little bit differently, and it just gives you that accent. So a little bit of background. Here's a side view, a mid-sagittal view of your vocal tract. The vocal cords are right here, and you can feel, if you put your hand over your throat on the outside, and you can talk, if you just say the word talk, say talk, say talk, say talk, and you'll feel vibration and stopping vibration and back and forth. Okay, so the vocal folds is where you get voiced and voiceless sounds. Voiced is when there's vibration, voiceless is when there's no vibration. And then air escapes through here, and it can go up through the back of your throat, it can escape through the nose, or it can escape through the mouth, and then there's different sounds that are being formed here. So voice onset time refers to when voicing begins. So the time that the voicing begins. And this is relevant for voiceless stops. So when you make a stop, so I'm just going to point here to the lips. When you make a p, right, you put your lips together, and there's air that's completely blocked for one point, so you're stopping the airflow, and then you release it. If I don't voice my vocal cords, I just get a p sound. If my vocal cords begin to vibrate, then there's the onset of voicing. Pa, ah, ah. So there's that voicing. The time delay between when I release my lips and the vocal cords begin to vibrate, that's called the voice onset time. So the difference between the opening of the closure, lips in this case, but it can be a different closure. It can be a t, for example, or a k. And when the vocal cords begin to vibrate. If it's longer, then you get that puff of air. So the longer voice onset time, you get a puff of air. The shorter, you don't get that. So, I think I was already kind of saying this, yes. So, voicing the sounds produced through the vocal cord vibration, like s versus z, so you can feel that. S. If you put your hand here on your throat, and you alternate between saying an S and a Z and holding them, you'll feel the alternation between vibration and non-vibration. Okay, so stop consonant is articulated by completely stopping the airflow, like I just did for the P. P, T, and K are the voiceless stops articulated in different places. So one is with the lips, one is with tongue tip and the alveolar ridge, that bumpy ridge behind your upper teeth, and the other, and the K, is with the back of the tongue up towards your soft palate. Okay, so during the stop closure itself, there's no vocal cord vibration, there's nothing. And when you release it and then a vowel follows, then voicing begins. So this is schematically how we can represent that. And you can think of this as, so here's 0 VOT. This vertical line is the plosive, or the stop, the closure release. Okay, so you can release the closure and then immediately begin to vibrate the vocal cords. you can release the closure, and then there's a little bit of lag before the vocal cords begin to vibrate, or you can start to vibrate the vocal cords before you release the closure, right? So for this positive VOT, voice onset time, right here, when there is a lag, that's when you get that puff of air. So you get that aspiration. So that we have that in English at the beginning of words for P, T, and K. 0, it coincides with the release, and then negative, it's basically like a B. So if you vibrate your vocal cords like you're humming, and you make a P, you try to make a P, it will sound like a B, because you can't make a P, you can't make a sound P that has this negative VOT, where the vocal cords are already vibrating. Okay, a lot of detail. Take phonology if you want to do that. Okay. So, English versus Spanish. English has aspirated stops, so it has that longer, it has that positive VOT. And Spanish has a shorter VOT. Okay, so if overhearing Spanish in childhood helps adult learners, then this voice onset time for overhears should be shorter than for L2 learners, right? So what this means is that and these L2 learners were English speakers, right? So they're used to saying words that have that positive, longer VOT. So let me just say, what is the word like taco? So you say, English speakers will say taco. You can feel that puff of air. Taco versus taco, right? So that taco versus taco. So that's what they're looking for. How are these VOTs? How are these pronounced? I don't know that they looked at taco. I'm just saying that. So they recorded the speakers and they measured all those voice onset times. Okay, and then for ba, da, and ga, that's the other task. I'm just going to go more quickly through this one. But when you have a B, for example, as in diga beso por favor, if you have it, if you have the B in between vowels, this B would be pronounced more like a V. Diga beso, and also the G actually. Diga beso por favor. Okay. So, the overhears in childhood were virtually like native speakers when it was in word initial position. And the L2 learners had longer VOT in initial position. Okay. So they were different. Okay. And the way they did this is they had 28 native Spanish speakers that provided accent ratings for all the participants. And they rated overhears more native-like than the L2 learners. So that's a long way of getting at, yes, overhearing does give you an advantage in pronunciation. Okay. And these benefits are actually measurable. We knew that from impressionistic studies, from just hearing speakers, but now we have experimental evidence that they are actually measurable benefits. And these benefits are noticeable because even average the native speakers they weren't trained linguists. They were just native speakers to be able to differentiate between the different accents. Some limitations of the study is that they didn't have huge numbers of speakers, so we don't really know how much overhearing is necessary. Is 1 year of overhearing necessary? 3 years of overhearing necessary? 5 years? So that's why we still need more work. Okay. A subsequent study looked at, okay, if overhearing gives you some benefits, then what about actually speaking? So this time they looked at Korean speech sounds produced by childhood speakers who had spoken Korean for a few years in childhood hearers, and then novice L2 learners and Korean speakers. So they had 4 groups here, and they are all students in a first-year Korean college class. Methodology was basically the same. They also measured the VOT for D and T because just the different contrast between English and Korean sounds. And they also had accent ratings by native speakers. And what they found for this study is that child hearing, overhearing in childhood, helps with perception. So, and that childhood speaking helps both in perception and in production. So basically, again, if a child overheard the language in childhood but didn't really speak it, they are good at distinguishing perceptually between different contrasts of sound contrast. But if they spoke it in childhood, then that also translates into pronunciation, production benefits as well. So what they found in this study is that childhood hearers outperformed, so they did better than second language learners in perception, but not in production. So in production, whether they overheard the language in childhood or whether they were just learning it for the first time as adults, like the L2 speakers, the production didn't show any payoffs, but perception did. And perception is important because you need to first perceive the sound properly, correctly, before you can produce it correctly. And then childhood speakers were as good as native speakers at perception and production. So speaking in childhood pays off in both dimensions. And childhood speakers produced phonemes like native speakers and did better than childhood hearers and second language learners. Okay. So it seems like these two studies might be contradictory, because for the Spanish case, overhearing translated into production benefits, but for Korean, overhearing only translated into perception benefits, not also production benefits. So we have to then think a little bit outside the box here and look at, okay, what are the contexts here? Okay, so for Korean, the Korean speakers who had overheard the language in childhood, they only overheard it in childhood, and that was it. Whereas for the Spanish speakers, again, because of the environment in Los Angeles, they probably continued to overhear it over time. So maybe overhearing is not enough to just overhear the language when you were just very young, but maybe overhearing over time translates into those payoffs later than just overhearing the language as a young child. And speaking definitely is much better than just overhearing. Okay. So even in these studies, though, the heritage speakers did better than second language learners in production, at least for the Spanish study. But and the heritage learners who had also spoken the language in childhood did better than second language learners in Korean as well, in both studies. So in both studies, heritage speakers did better than second language learners. The native speakers, though, still were rated more native than the heritage speakers. So again, they rank somewhere like better than second language, but there's something about them. So there is this like heritage accent, as Masha Polinsky calls it. And this could be due to this convergence on a good enough production of sounds that's shared among the heritage and the dominant language. So basically, if you're speaking two languages and both of your languages have the sound ah. Well, let's say in language A, the ah is very, like it's an ah, and in language B, it's an ah. But it doesn't really matter, like there isn't a distinction between those two ahs in either language. Then the heritage speaker will just kind of converge on something that's good enough and works for both of them, and that's what they go with. So that could be what explains the heritage accent. This is still a hypothesis, and we don't really know for sure right now. There's more research being done. So the takeaways from here are that even overhearing a language in childhood, it provides benefits, even if those benefits might only extend to perception, like in the case of Korean. But then if you have benefits in perception, that can also translate to production over time. Speaking the language in childhood is better than just overhearing the language. Still, there is a heritage accent, likely due to making the most of both linguistic inventories that you have. Okay, and there's still a lot of research to be done in this area, particularly in cases such as tone, intonation, and prosody. We haven't even really begun to scratch the surface there. So I know this was a lot of detailed information, but I hope that at least you can get these takeaways and that you find them interesting and beneficial.
Beautiful.
Yes?
I've been hanging out for,
Really?
yeah.
Yeah.